Well, we're lucky to have Elise Hicks back with us for round two for your mental preparation. Elise has gone to Young Riders and competed up to intermediate and has had lots of good results and now has a real job. So she's going to tell you more about that. And you go.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, today we're going to do more of the strategies. So last time we did a session more about reflection and awareness and me kind of explaining what different elements are, such as performance anxiety. And today is going to be a lot more focused on strategies, when to use them. So a little bit more of different strategies to try and use, but then also forms of implementation and how you fit that into your show season. So it's going to be a bit more informational, but then I hope we can still kind of share at the end too of maybe if you resonate with some strategies that you've tried, feel like it's worked, if you have questions about certain things about implementing them, we'll go over that at the end. So it's just going to be me rapid firing for the first bit so we can go over some learning in that sense. So we're gonna I added some things from last session. I tried to fit in some of what people were asking for. So I did that. I don't think I fit everything in for today, but we're gonna kind of go back to performance anxiety. I'm not gonna kind of re-explain what it is and go into the reflection pieces. If you do want more context on that, you can go back to the other presentation. But today we're going to be going into how to calm the anxiety and warm up or about to compete or even in the ring as well, depending on maybe cross country longer, and calming strategies for during the day of the competition or days leading up as well. Then we're going to go back to emotion regulation. A lot of feedback I got from the last one was wanting to regulating strategies for between phases, especially on the one days. So we're going to go into that, as well as regulating strategies after competition. So the days afterwards and between competitions. Then we're going to target that burnout. There's a lot of questions about different self-care strategies and plans, plan being the biggest one, and then also some factors of balancing life and competition. The last two, we didn't go over this in the last session, but I want to add it because there was a lot of interest in terms of having like how to advocate for yourself as an athlete when you're trying different strategies, when you're feeling anxious the day of or having a hard time regulating, how we lead that. And then also a little segment on how coaches, parents, and other support members can support the athletes in those moments too. So there's a lot of questions there. So yeah, that's what we're going to go over today. So we're going to start with performance anxiety and we're going to go talk about the warm-ups. This is kind of when you have the least amount of time to intervene, so to say, but the anxiety is usually the highest. Usually our symptoms of anxiety spike the closer we get to entering the show ring. Sometimes it depends which when you're going into, if it's cross country or dressage or whatever you find yourself becoming more anxious for coming up to that event becomes more anxiety inducing. So the problem with that though is that we're on a shorter timeline, especially in the warm-up ring or you're about to go into the ring and you have to focus on so many other things. You have to focus on just warming up yourself and warming up your horse and listening to your coach's instructions. There's a lot happening. So first of all, you have to identify what you're more comfortable with in terms of warm-up. Do you want a longer warm up because you find implementing other strategies for yourself to be really helpful and you need time for that? Or do you find yourself resonating more with distraction type activities, which meaning, kind of rapid fire conversations, focusing more on the task at hand and not really letting yourself think about the anxiety parts? I mean, neither of them are wrong. They're both okay. It just depends on what works better for you. And I'm going to go over a list of different strategies, and some are more distraction based and some are more mindfulness based. And you can kind of decide either if a combination is helpful for you or one or the other works better for you too. So the first one, general breathing exercise 3-4-5. The way that one works is inhaling for 3, holding for 4, and exhaling for 5. The reason I talk about that one a lot is because it's more effective for getting oxygen to your brain. So you can slow down with the exhale being longer than the inhale. It allows you to slow down. So slow down your thoughts, slow down your physiological experience, slow down your body, slow down your heart rate. And it helps to slow your internal experience too. It slows your thoughts as well. So I like that one as just a general grounding. Another one I like about that one is if some people don't want people to know that they're doing it and no one can tell that you're doing this breathing exercise, you can do it in the ring, and more so, maybe not the counting part specifically, but even in the ring going around, like really focusing on the key phrase of inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale while you're going around. Because that's a problem that comes up sometimes. Sometimes we stop breathing when we're feeling really anxious or really stressed or in the ring, and that can be a big problem, causing a lot of tension, right? Attention, we're not flowing as well. A horse reads that. So that also kind of helps keep you calm and your body moving to send signals to your horse that way. And then there's one counting down from 20. So that's one that's more of a distraction. If you feel like you just need to separate your mind from your internal experience, meaning different anxious thoughts or feelings that way. So focusing on a number, it doesn't have to be 20, it can be something else, and focusing on counting down. Another one being the five senses technique. So this one is also a distraction slash grounding technique. It's a bit of a combination. I find it's really helpful for distracting. There's a proper way to do this. I mean, you can do kind of like labeling five things you see, four things you touch, three things you hear, and so on. But you can play around with this one. If you resonate more with a certain sense, I personally resonate with sight better. I would rather pick 10 different things that I can see than go into the different ones. It's very susceptible to what you find most productive. So whatever works better for you, play around with it and test it. You don't have to follow it exactly how it's said if it doesn't work for you that way. So that one's nice because you can mend it. And it does both. It grounds you to connect with your external environment. So it pulls you out of your internal thoughts and anxious feelings and has you focus on your external environment. So that's another nice part about that one. In terms of holding something cold, so I mean, we bring a lot of times we bring ice for our horses, our horses' legs after. We already usually have it on hand. So one thing about that, there's a temperature change element to regulation and anxiety. So if you hold something cold, whether it's a ice cube or an ice pack, put it on yourself, hold it, it immediately kind of is the same thing of taking you out of your internal and focusing on your external environment and what you're feeling against you in that sense. Ice packs are also just great to have on hand for first aid. If something happens and you hurt yourself that way, it's always a good thing to have on hand. So why not use it in that sense too? If it's something you're already going to have with you, might as well make it as a strategy to help in those moments too. Another one being self-talk. I mean, that one's so, again, individual to what you find helpful. Is there a certain phrasing that you find that you can focus on, whether it's you got this or stay calm or it'll be okay? And if you focus on one short phrase and try and repeat that one over and over again, so you're focusing on that phrase rather than your other thoughts, and it's positive in that sense. So it can work that way. Um, in the ring, inhale, exhale, I kind of touched on that with the breathing exercise. That's just really helpful. There's not a lot you can do when you are in the ring, especially like show jump, for example, so short and it comes up so fast in that sense. So there's not a lot you can do to necessarily calm in the ring in that sense. But one thing you can do is focus on your breath in that sense, focusing on inhale, exhale, and repeating that to force your body to continue to breathe in that sense to calm. That naturally calms your body. It naturally calms drops your shoulders, you continue to follow along. So that can be a helpful one that's right in the moment as well. Another one being physical grounding, so wiggling your toes. Again, the point between that one is try to ground you, try and again take you out of your internal experience and put you out into your external experience and feeling your body and what's going on your actual physiological body rather than your internal thoughts in that sense. So again, kind of wiggling your toes, maybe pressing the balls of your feet harder into the stirrups to feel the contact more, trying to make contact and really focus on what you're touching. Kind of falls into the five senses, but can be its own strategy that way. And then there's the muscle tension and release. This is a really helpful one, especially as athletes when you guys are riding, because a lot of times when we're feeling really anxious or stressed, we can kind of shoulders go way up or, elbows and wrists become really tight. So it's actually can be really helpful to focus on muscle tension and release. So what I mean by that is can pick, you can pick whatever is easiest or whatever you prefer, or where you feel the most tight. And that could be your shoulders, for example. So the way this one works is you kind of squeeze them. You actually tense up your muscles all the way up to your chin, pretty much as tight as you can go for about 3 seconds. And then you want to release slowly for three and bring them back down. And you want to do that You can cycle through about 8 to 10 times in that sense, could go longer. But to make it more quick, you could do 8 to 10. And that just really helps to create flow through the tension in your muscles, relax them. Again, you're focusing on something else other than your own internal experience and thoughts. So focusing on fixing and helping your body relax to help your internal relax as well. So a lot of different kinds of strategies in that way. Again, there's even more than this list, but this is what people find pretty overall commonly helpful. And there's different kinds. So I think one thing that people think is that, distraction can somehow be a really good thing or distraction can be a really bad thing. It's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It just depends on what works best for you. Now, distraction isn't great after a competition. No, we need to actually process how you're feeling and what's going on there and try and figure out what's the cause of all this pressure and anxiety. But in the moment, this is about mental performance at this point. This is about what's going to help you relax most and quickly before you go into the ring. So, helpful strategies in this sense. Okay. So then we go into anxiety on the day of the show or leading up to it. So we're not so much talking about right before heading into a phase or right before heading into an event at this point. Usually we have a whole day. Obviously, it's harder to do some of these things when you have multiple horses on the same day, a little bit harder. So then maybe your focus is more on the days leading up. So on the day of the shows, you may be having some internal and external symptoms. When I say internal symptoms, I'm more so talking about negative thoughts, anticipatory thoughts about performance, usually in a negative way, something that could go wrong, or external symptoms. So you could have going quiet, you can have being really chatty, feeling physically ill, shakiness, sometimes feeling faint, or having like a constant racing heart as well. So those are some things to kind of be mindful of. But if we're talking about strategies in this sense, I want to talk about challenging negative thoughts. This is an important one. So this is one you can do either the day of the show, or the days leading up when you're having those intrusive thoughts coming in. And one thing we use in psychotherapy is we want to do a few steps when you're having these negative thoughts. So first step is to validate the negative thought. Yeah, I know that sounds crazy. Don't want to validate. That sounds like the absolute wrong thing to do. But no, and we have to validate why you're having the thought. We need to figure out, is it based on evidence? Has something like this happened before? Have you seen something like this happen before to someone else? What is it that's driving this thought for you? We have to acknowledge that part. Then we want to challenge the thought. So what that means is come up with evidence as to why it's not true. So we call that stage the evidence against. What's the evidence against that thought? What evidence do you have suggesting that that's not necessarily true? Let's say you had one bad ride, for example. Let's say maybe, I don't know, maybe you fell off at the last show. And then your evidence is, but maybe that's the only time you've fallen off on a show before. So your evidence for would be, okay, well, I did fall off last time. Okay, there's some evidence there, some validity to it. But also, I mean, how many times did that happen? Happened once, didn't happen at the show before that, didn't happen last time. So there you also have evidence to suggest that that won't happen again when you're challenging it. So you want to use it as more of an analytical approach. And then you can finish off with a more balanced thought. Okay, yes, this happened to me at the last event, but it was one time. I have many other shows where that has not happened. I've trained in a different way since then, other reasons as to why you can challenge that thought. So that's an effective way. Also doing some calming exercises. This is more for the days leading up. So maybe it's working out, light jog, maybe it's going for a walk, or just doing something that brings calmness for you. That can be helpful as well to kind of distract, but also move your body. There's also 3-4-5 breathing. You can do that at any time. You can do it. It doesn't have to be in the warm-up ring. It doesn't have to be used right in the crisis moment there, but it can be used at multiple stages. Sometimes going to sleep. So that's another one. So sometimes when you're having performance anxiety, something it can do is stop you from falling asleep well, and you have a really terrible night's sleep, and then you don't perform as well the next day because you're exhausted because you've been anxious. So one thing about that, you can do the 3-4-5 breathing, and that's actually really helpful to fall asleep because you're focusing on, again, kind of distraction because you're counting, but then you're also slowing it down, slowing your nervous system, preparing it for sleep. So that's another one that can be helpful there. Positive self-talk. Yeah. We need to have those positive phrasings, and that can go from kind of a reframe of how you view mistakes, but having positive self-talk, remember basically reflecting, okay, what are the things that have gone well in my other shows? What evidence do I have for that? Reflecting on the positive elements in that, trying to connect with it. Then we have imagery during course walks. Okay, so this is really helpful, especially if one of your performance anxiety is very specific to, I don't know, having a certain rail, having stops at a certain, not being able to get through a combination, having a fall at a certain place. This can be really helpful to imagine yourself jumping each combination and jump. I remember one thing I struggled with was, imagine doing this imagery, but then imagining having intrusive images of watching myself have a refusal. And so I would force myself to not actually leave the combination until I can actually have myself imagine a positive go through before I moved on and went to the next course and the next jump. And it's hard because in that moment, it's so important to challenge it when it's coming up, because it's not to say that it's never going to happen and we're never going to have those intrusive thoughts or that imagery of a negative experience, but we do have to challenge it in those moments. And that is more important than you may think, to try and imagine that and imagine yourself having a positive going over the jump successfully and it looking nice in that sense. So that can be really helpful. Also to calm some nerves there. Again, holding something cold, especially if you're feeling ill. That's one thing for people who have symptoms of feeling ill, feeling faint when they become really anxious or nervous. It can be really helpful to have that ice pack again, kind of like on your forehead, holding it on your body to kind of bring your temperature and regulate your mind and the racing thoughts that you're having, to slow it down and reflect. So that can be something that's helpful, especially in those cases as well. So I'm gonna allow for questions, but we're gonna go through all the content first, and then we're gonna talk about each part for questions at the end. So I'm gonna keep going through to the next one. Um, okay. Emotion regulation. So first we're gonna talk about regulating between phases, because this is very relevant in our sport. They got multiple phases that we need to be able to regulate through, especially on the one days. And it can be really quick, especially if you have multiple horses or the timing that you get is really close sometimes with scheduling. So you don't always have a lot of time, but it's really, really important. So we may experience feelings of disappointment, frustration, or sadness after a phase. I mean, we felt we could have gone better than it did. However, we have to stay regulated because we have another phase to focus on, and we can't let feelings about one phase interfere with the other. So, I mean, it's not even just about the negative feelings. Sometimes if we have a really great dressage test or a really great show jumping round, right, we might go into it feeling overconfident to the next phase, even if we have really, really positive feelings after, it can interfere with the next phase. One way to know that is if you check your scoring between each phase and you see you're winning after dressage, which is amazing and so nice to see. But it can be hard because it can interfere with your feelings about how the day is going and can lead to some overconfidence or maybe not planning as detailed as you might when you feel like you have areas to improve in. So that can also impact in a different way. So what I would say is the goal is to stay at a baseline, positive yet neutral state of mind for optimal performance. So it's good to, you don't want to feel negatively, but staying in that neutral yet slightly positive can be helpful. Unless you're someone that really thrives on overconfidence and feeling that way, that's great. It's very individual in terms of what works well for you, but typically that kind of baseline positive and neutral can be helpful. And that's where we want to be. So in order to some strategies with that, the first thing we want to do is reduce the intensity of your emotion. So that's the first thing. You need to be able to identify what you're feeling, which we discussed in the last session, the first group session, about how to identify what it is that you're actually feeling and to have that awareness. But then we want to reduce the intensity right away, pretty much. It's okay to have the feeling come up, but we want to reduce how intense it is so that it doesn't interfere with the other aspects going on for you. So that can be done again with either a breathing exercise, because again, that kind of helps getting oxygen to your brain helps you to rationalize and come into that survival mode of the intensity of your emotions. I talk a lot about in therapy about survival versus rational brain. And so when we're really triggered by something, we go into our survival brain and become very triggered. It's very intense. It's really hard to do anything productive, like challenge the thoughts and do those kinds of things. So what we want to do is get you out of the survival brain and into your rational brain where you can actually challenge things and refocus and evaluate. So we need to do mindfulness practices to get you out of your survival brain and transition you back into your rational so you can actually think clearly. Also helps in performance-wise when you're trying to think of your strategies and the plan and the aids you want to give. We need to be more in our rational mind for that. So again, kind of like the breathing exercises, if more mindfulness approach works for you, just slow everything down, or distraction. Is distraction helpful in the moment because it's quick if you got an hour between, right? If that's helpful, maybe that kind of five senses work, temperature change, going back to that. Then we want to evaluate. This one is important. Do I need time alone or do I need it to be around my support system? It is such an individual experience of what you need in those moments. If you had a really hard round, you're feeling really disappointed, really frustrated, you might need time alone for 20 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, however long it is. You might just need time alone to regulate. Maybe you regulate better when you're alone because you're actually able to do those strategies, think to yourself, calm yourself that way. Maybe you really need that support. Maybe you really need certain phrases from your coach, from your parent, from your support system to be able to feel better too. So that's something for you to reflect on. You need to evaluate that in that moment. Do I need to be alone or do I need to be around my support system? And then you need to communicate that. And we're going to get into that more a bit later about communicating it. But that awareness of what you need, very important. In terms of refocusing, so that's also very important. We need to only focus on the phase ahead and preparing for that phase. So there kind of needs to be a transition moment where we leave that behind in that phase. Sometimes you can do for reframing is, there's nothing I can do to change that phase now. If you're still in the competition, you have more phases to come up. Great. You have areas to test other aids that you've learned at home. You have other experiences to move yourself up in the standings. If those go well, there's a lot more opportunity there. So kind of having that refocus of, okay, I have a new opportunity now for the next phase and to try and only focus on that next phase at that point. Doesn't mean you're not going to go back to the drawing board and have a meeting discussion with your coach about what could have been done differently, but maybe refocusing in that moment is most helpful. Evaluate, just looking at my scores after each event benefit my next phase. You need to really play around with that. It's hard. If you look at your dressage score, your show jump score, and you see you're in the bottom, how does that affect you going into cross country? Maybe it doesn't affect you at all. Maybe you have that strategies that you use and it doesn't affect you and you have that really positive mindset and that's great. But does it make it worse? Does it put you in a negative mind space, headspace? Does it make you feel really negatively, make you feel sad, upset, disappointed? And how does that affect you going into your next phase? So we need to really reflect on, is that helping me or is it not helping me? And again, it's individual. Do you see that you're maybe mid-pack and does it really motivate you to keep going and want to do better? Great, then it's a helpful strategy. But again, we need to evaluate, does this cause more risk than benefit for me? And evaluate that. Reframing. So does one event determine my result for the entire competition? So we want to have those bird's eye view thoughts that I like to say in that sense of, you're really focused on the one phase that went poorly in your opinion. But looking at it from a broader perspective, does that affect the entire competition? No. And the best thing about eventing is that you can go all over the place in your scoring throughout the day. You can start at the top and unfortunately end up at the bottom. You can start at the bottom or mid-pack and you work yourself all the way up. It can be so subject to change. And so that's why it's so important to kind of keep it moving and to kind of keep viewing those new opportunities because it gives you an opportunity to change in your scoring and change in your results and to still learn a lot in your score as well. So trying to look at it from that perspective too, and how, one event doesn't determine the entire competition as well. So those are different strategies for between phases, more specifically. Then there's some strategies for post-competition. So It's easy to have a good competition with results that you are proud of and walk away feeling happy and you're looking forward to the next event. Things are going well. Awesome. That's a really nice feeling to have. It's harder to have mistakes and things go wrong and walk away to train harder for the next competition. You need a lot of resilience to be able to do that. And so we want to look at that from the perspective, how do we build the resilience in between so that I can do that and I can go back to the drawing board and I can work hard and continue to stay motivated, even though I feel disappointed or frustrated from something that happened in the last competition. So to have resilience, we need to remove the barrier of emotion dysregulation from the last competition, whether that's your frustration, your disappointment, your sadness, interferes with how we train, and then it interferes with the next competition or performance the next way. So if we're coming into training the next day, or not, sorry, not the next day, but the following week to retrain after competition, are still feeling really frustrated or really sad, our body language is going to show that. It's going to affect the motivation. It's going to affect your horse's perspective on the situation. It's going to be harder to come back and actually train productively in that sense. So a couple strategies in that sense is reframing the mistake and what it means to you. So this kind of touches on perfectionism a little bit. But what does a mistake mean to you? Does it mean that, the season's ruined? Does it mean that the whole thing was horrible? Or does it mean, like, what does that mean? And does it mean a learning opportunity or a moment for growth and a moment to learn something and come back better the next time, and how we view what a actual mistake means. But the first part of that is you have to reflect. What does it actually mean to you? Is it that negative connotation at first? Is it that part? And how do we reframe that into a learning opportunity and what it means? And retraining that. It's a lot of retraining mindset in that sense. Challenging the negative thoughts that come up. You may be having, feeling really dysregulated. Let's think about how, let's say you're sad, feeling sadness, and it's really intense in the days after, thinking I'll never come back from this. My season is ruined. Okay, going back to the evidence for, evidence against, and the challenging there, see if we're going with my season is ruined. Okay, well, what's the evidence against that? Okay, well, I'm at competition number 3 of my season. I have 6 planned. I have 3 more to go. My season is not ruined. I have new opportunities to come back from in that sense. And it's one result. It's one result in that sense. It doesn't necessarily affect your entire season. So really trying to reframe that and challenge that when it's coming up. One thing about challenging thoughts that I'll include in here is that sometimes writing it out is more productive. So sometimes if you're having a hard time challenging it internally because it's just racing and spiraling and you can't interrupt it, something that can be really helpful is writing it out. So writing out what your actual thought is, and then writing out, again, kind of like validating it, why you're having it, and then writing out all of the reasons why it's evidence against, or it's not valid, or how you can prove it wrong in that sense. So that's another strategy for using the challenging negative thoughts technique, is to try and write it out. If you're having a hard time, it's not as effective internally. And especially post-competition, the days afterwards, when you have time to be able to write that out and reflect on it, is really important there too. Reflect on what went well. Yeah, I think that gets overlooked sometimes. For writers, we're focused. So if there is a mistake, if there is something that's going wrong, it's really easy to focus on that one thing and to focus on it. And because that's the part that we kind of want to focus on. Usually we go back to the drawing board. Okay, this is what went wrong. This is how we're going to fix it. But also what went right. What aids were you able to use that you've been working on in training that have been harder for you to use in competition that went well this time? Maybe it was your attitude that stayed really positive throughout the experience, and that was something that went well. But yeah, different aids, different phases, and always taking the opportunity to think of what went well and to try and balance that out and create almost a longer list of what went well compared to what went wrong. And so in terms of doing that, I have this kind of T-chart idea of separating it. You want to have a column of things that went well and things that didn't go as planned. So not mistakes and not, the end of my career as a writer. It's, things that didn't go as planned. I planned it one way, it didn't go that way. Here's what I'm going to try and do. That's kind of how you go back to the drawing board. That's how I'm going to try and do things differently. But language is very important in that and how you view that too. So, but having the two columns, writing it out, you can do it internally, that's fine. But I think it's sometimes more helpful to make it concentrated, writing it out, to kind of, reflect on things that went well, things that didn't go as planned. And again,
Oh yeah,
trying
no,
to
he's having
have, um,
hernia operation scheduled for this one, so he's
I think we have someone's microphone on. We can just make sure that everyone's muted, please. Thank you. Just so that everyone can hear me clearly. So yeah, having the two columns is very important, and it's helpful to try to challenge yourself to make the list of things that went well longer, even if they're more focused, more specific, smaller things, challenging yourself to do that as well. So that's something to reflect on, as well as continuing to use mindfulness strategies when intensity occurs. So it doesn't mean that you might not have spikes over the coming days. You might be triggered by something certain. Maybe it's days after the competition, you've kind of processed it, but then you see maybe someone's, I don't know, made a really great post about how their weekend went, and it kind of triggers you again to reflect on that. Again, going back to, mindfulness strategies, using the breathing, using the five senses to kind of get back to that rational mind and be able to use those strategies again and try and challenge it and reflect on it and go back. Okay. So that's a bit in terms of regulating strategies. Now, we had a lot of questions last time about burnout as well. So again, to kind of get the definition of burnout and reflecting on that, going back to the last presentation to go over those, but we're going to go over some strategies and plans now, because a big part of burnout is planning. It's a big part of planning, a lot of executive functioning involved. So we want to be able to avoid / heal burnout so you can get back to enjoying the sport that you love, that you might lose that interest in or lose that enjoyment when you're burnt out. We don't want you to lose that passion for your sport due to that prolonged exhaustion and exposure to burnout. So there's a few steps to this one. With step one, we want to have awareness. So again, discuss that in last session. If you want to know more about how you can be aware and be attuned to that, you can revisit that session. But the second step is, knowing what self-care activities work for you. That is way easier said than done. And a big barrier that I hear from a lot of different clients and people say is that I don't have any time to do self-care. Fair enough. You might not have a full day to take off. Maybe not, right? With what's going on. So that's why I encourage everyone to make a list of 3 categories for self-care. So we want to have a list of things that bring you some sort of restoration, relaxation, um, relaxation, because you want to be able to have things that are short for when you have a much shorter time frame. So we have 10 minutes, 1 hour, a few hours, or that could be, a day if you have it. So a few hours to a day. The most important part about making these lists is the 10 minutes. We need to have a long list of 10-minute things that actually build that restoration for you. So, and then the step 3 being, plan the self-care into your busy schedules. Now, that's again easier said than done. So you can pull from the different timed activities though to see what fits best in your schedule. So for example, for shorter things, again, reflect on what works well for you. I've made a list here of, a shower, a quick journaling session, as a face mask, reading quickly. Maybe it's a guided breathing reset or a meditation. Maybe it's a tea break or a coffee break, or maybe a 10-minute stretching to kind of be attuned with your body again. So again, there's so much more than this list, but having a list of things that you can do that are 5 to 10 minutes long that you can do. Because everyone has 10 minutes. I don't care. I don't care who you are and what you're doing. Everyone has 10 minutes in that sense. It's just when you fit it in. When do you have that 10 minutes? When can you give it that attention? Then there's 1 hour. Much better. Not everyone has the hour every day, but sometimes in a week there's an hour. So there's a going for a walk, or maybe it's more relaxing workout. Maybe it's a massage, like a body care treatment, reading, taking a bath, low stimulation hobby. If you have other hobbies or activities that you like doing, like painting and whatnot, something that's again low stimulation, engaging in that for an hour. It's something that's still enjoyable. Maybe it's calling a friend or a family member. Maybe you don't have time to necessarily go visit a friend. If you don't have the time, maybe it's a phone call. being able to connect that way, or watching a favorite show. Again, many other things to this list. Reflect on what works for you and things that you enjoy in that sense. And then there's a few hours to a day. Maybe it's making plans and catching up with friends, going to try a new activity or engage in a different sport that's relaxing because it's not something you care about that much, you're not that invested in. Visiting with a family, or maybe it's a small day trip somewhere, something you find enjoyable or relaxing. So the key is you want to find different activities that allow you to relax and recharge. But the biggest part of this is I want each person to kind of reflect on 3 different categories of time and what you can fit into that as well. So you have things to pull from in that sense. And then prioritization is such an important part too. I mean, we look at, okay, sure, I'm prioritizing my sport in that sense because, the more time you put in, the better you do. Yes. But if it's to the point where you're experiencing such burnout and exhaustion that it's hurting your performance, well, then we need to reprioritize what's happening here because if it's negatively affecting your performance, then we're not able to sustain that amount of time necessarily. So, in terms of balancing life and sport, again, kind of what I'm going back to is, we're told the more time you put into your craft, the better you'll be. Not always. Yes, that in general, it's a great concept and you want to put a lot of time into what you're passionate about. Absolutely, of course. But if we overwork ourselves too far, we might experience that burnout and therefore worsen our performance. So it's very important to have a balance between sport, life, and responsibilities of work, school, whatever stage of life you're in. So one tip for this one is prioritize like an athlete, not a perfectionist. So if you have that perfectionism driving you for your performance, maybe putting way more time and energy into focusing really hard on maybe it's career, maybe it's your sport, and figuring out what your non-negotiables are. So what can you not give up in a week, but then what can you also bend and make room for in terms of self-care as well. Time blocking. So, I mean, scheduled breaks like your mandatory training sessions, right? We fit our lessons and our rides pretty easily into our schedule. Maybe not easily because work and school can be hard too, but it's something that we prioritize. So kind of going back to that prioritizing, make a time blocking, put it into a section in your schedule for a self-care activity. Maybe it's one of your 10-minute ones. Maybe it's your hour one. And you can't get lazy with this one because I think sometimes people think, oh, I'll use one of my 10-minute ones, and then you don't use it because it's such a short time frame, it's not prioritized as much. No, time block the 10 minutes into what you want to do. Really commit to that because then you're really giving yourself that opportunity to try and engage with that as well. And separating identities. So when balancing your self-care and socializing in sport, sometimes that's having different friendships and connections in sport versus, your personal life, and just being able to separate it. It's not your entire identity. There's many identities that we have within sport, within work, within our social lives, our personal lives, family lives, right? So being able to separate those identities, and we think that we just have to focus really hard on one thing. Planning ahead, so school and work wise, to avoid feeling like you're catching up after horse shows. Yeah. So if you're already behind in school, going into a show, or behind maybe some work that you're doing, it's going to feel way more overwhelming and you're really going to feel the burnout crash afterwards. So sometimes it can be helpful to plan ahead. That way, again, kind of going back to scheduling, trying to set yourself up in a way that you can prioritize feeling neutral, happy, positive after a show and not feeling like you're struggling to catch up in that sense. So trying to plan ahead that way. And having a more realistic outcome. So what is manageable to do well in each of these areas? Not perfect, and valuing progress over perfection. If you're, working full time and have a busy career, but you're also doing this as well, and you're going to events and having a whole season, it's really hard to be perfect at all of those things, right? You can't put all of your time into that as well. So we need to kind of readjust your expectation. What are different goals going to be? If it can't be the standard that you want it to be, well, what's a new standard? How can we adjust that so you're not feeling like you're constantly having to pour all of your time into maybe work and writing or school and writing in that sense? How do we change those to set ourselves up for success and well-being rather than feeling like we're constantly disappointing ourselves or not meeting our expectations and adding stress to it. Um, and then, yeah, scheduling categories. So this is an interesting one. So there should be high focus days in your schedule. If you're looking at like a weekly schedule, maybe there's your high focus days where you have a full day of like work, school, and training, and it's the busiest days of the week, scheduling that in. Knowing which days are your moderate days, some more balanced workload, maybe some light self-care, social time, and then a recovery block. So at least an hour or a couple hours off for you where you can do something for yourself. So having those different categories to reflect on when you're doing your scheduling as well can be helpful. Okay, and then advocating for yourself. Okay, this is a hard one. I think sometimes as athletes, we kind of really just want everyone around us to already know what we're thinking in the moment and to act accordingly. And unfortunately, that's not always how it works. And we do need to have more of that effective communication, but also know for yourself, what do you need in these moments? So it is your responsibility as the athlete to tell the people around you what you need on competition days. This requires you testing different strategies and doing some trial and error for yourself to know what works for you. So we need to figure that out first. That's step one. Figure out what you actually need and reflect on that. And then telling people around you, telling your coaches, your support circle, what you need to thrive on those days. For example, if you know that after a round, maybe a mistake was made or maybe something went wrong and you're feeling frustrated, you're feeling overwhelmed, you're feeling upset about it, and you need 10 to 15 minutes alone without discussing it to give yourself time to regulate, you can do that. You can communicate that. If that's something that you need in those moments, that's fine, right? It's nothing against that, but you need to be able to know that that's what you need, and then you need to be able to ask for it in that sense. So in terms of communicating, a couple steps there. One of the biggest things is communicating what you need before the actual show. Because sometimes if we're during the show and it's hard to communicate effectively when we're actually heightened. If you're already feeling the emotion intensely, it can be really hard to communicate it thoughtfully and calmly to describe exactly what it is you need. So this requires you to reflect before the competition and take some time, whether it's, I don't know, in a lesson with your coach or with your parents or your support circle leading up, to communicate, if this happens or if I'm feeling this way, can I give you this signal? And I think I need this leading up to it. I think that will help me reset faster, whatever it is. Maybe it's not time alone. Maybe you want to discuss it right away. Maybe you have certain ideas of what like encouraging phrases could be for you that are helpful. But again, kind of knowing that and then letting those people know so they can try to adhere to that as well. And then during the show, being able to communicate it in the moment. No, this is a bit different. Sometimes if you feel like you have a hard time communicating it effectively in the moment, have a signal. Have like a short catchphrase or a signal to your coach or your parent or someone in your support circle to communicate that you need that in that sense and that both everyone's on the same page in that sense. And I think having that communication is really important. But again, biggest part is that you need to know what you need as well. And then being able to kind of have that open conversation beforehand so that you can thrive better on those days. If you know that it's going to trigger you to come out of the ring and immediately kind of discuss it, okay, you need maybe a reset. You need a bit of time first. Maybe you discuss it an hour later or at the end of the day. And that's when you kind of have those conversations, but you need to be able to ask for it because at the end of the day, it's your performance. If these kind of things are affecting you negatively and you want to change that in terms of how you function on those days, it is kind of coming back to that responsibility that you can communicate that as well. In terms of, for coaches and parents and support systems to support the athletes, I think there's so many things that can be done that way too that can be really helpful in supporting. So I think, coaches do such a great job of creating successful athletes and they teach us how to improve our skills and support us at the shows and help us to improve during our training sessions. And they're such a big part of our athletic experience. But I think one common mistake sometimes for coaches is maybe not asking some of those questions of like, what do you need right now? Or what do you need to feel more calm right now? I think sometimes as coaches, we think that there's something that we already need to know how to help them. It's like we should already know what it is that they need, or maybe it's helpful to use things that worked for me and maybe it'll help them. And there's kind of like this pressure of I need to know how to help already. But I think going back to just being curious about it in that sense of, I think sometimes just having that curiosity of what do you need? How can I help in that sense kind of reduces the pressure that you feel to need to know the answer and support them. But also just helps you be more individualized and see your support to them if they can kind of ask that. And maybe I think sometimes in a dynamic, sometimes for riders, maybe they feel intimidated or feel like they're maybe doing something wrong if they have to ask for that from their coaches. So sometimes it's helpful as a coach to maybe initiate the conversation or to initiate the question in that sense. And again, it can come from before the show. It can maybe the rider's having a hard time articulating what they need properly at the show because they're feeling so heightened. So again, maybe it's kind of like the next lesson after a show or kind of like the lesson before. And just kind of asking and having that open conversation to see how you can support, and maybe they'll have an answer there too, something they can help with. I think some things, what you can do to help your riders feel supported is maybe asking them what they need from you in those anxious or dysregulated moments. So again, approaching it with curiosity, and asking those questions before the shows, kind of going back to how, hard to articulate sometimes in the moment. I think I've heard a couple of coaches mention that, maybe I ask in the moment, but they don't know. And that's hard. If they're not able to articulate it, they're feeling so anxious, they really don't know in that moment. Again, it's helpful to have those reflection conversations afterwards to really process or before. And maybe that helps to remind the rider their strategies in the moment. So if you're curious and you kind of know or ask your rider ahead of time, what is it that helps you in those moments? It can be helpful if you know those strategies so that you can help remind them. Because again, sometimes if the riders are feeling so anxious, they might, when we're in our survival brain, again, survival rational brain, we remember the strategies that we need to use and implement them. But in our rational brain, it can be harder to do that. And sometimes riders need reminders. So maybe as a coach, in that sense, you can try to remind them of the different things that, they've told you or things that maybe work for them too. And trying to follow their request plan. I mean, it's hard. Show days are busy. You may have a lot of different students to support. Maybe you're riding yourself and there's a lot going on. But it can be helpful to have maybe certain notes. If you have like maybe a note on your phone where you kind of have it written down of maybe each student you're going to have that day, a little bit of blurb about what they kind of need those moments to maybe help you, a quick reminder in the moment too, can be helpful. Yeah, kind of just trying to follow the request and plan. If they've advocated saying they need space before immediate follow-up, maybe writing it down to discuss it at a better time or a later time, really just to help the athlete thrive on that day in that sense. But some reflection things that you can pose as a coach, and you can assign homework, some reflective activities. Maybe it's a post-show T-chart that you want to, asking them to reflect on. Maybe it's something that you follow up on. Maybe it's something you don't, if you trust in kind of the rider's going to do it, that's fine. Maybe you want to check in on it in the next lesson, or having a plan that way of, okay, like I kind of want to see your T-chart of reflecting on these so that, we're both on the same page, but also to know that your riders are reflecting on that. And also to assign rest time. So this is such an interesting one, especially for burnout and self-care. I think as not just coaches, but like in general, we kind of plan out what the rest days are going to look like for our horses, especially if it's like a bigger competition or a 3-day or even after a 1-day. How many, you kind of tell your riders, okay, give them this many days off. This is what we're going to do on each day leading back up to kind of regroup and give them that rest time. But I think it's also really helpful to model and ask, what are you going to do as a rider to rest? Rest during those times, and kind of sometimes just asking the question of, what are you going to do to recover on these days that your horse is recovering, also just sparks awareness for the rider to think about it. You don't necessarily have to plan it with them and, kind of suggest things in that sense, but even just kind of asking that question poses reflection for them to think about, okay, I can also rest too, or I can find these opportunities. And again, going back to self-care of it, do you have a full day, or is it the 10 minutes, or is it the hour? And what can you do in that sense? So that's kind of your responsibility as the rider as well. But I think from a coaching perspective, it can be helpful to ask that question, especially when we're planning recovery for the horses, and asking that curiosity question of what are you going to do as the rider to rest and recover from this? Okay. So, to kind of recap, I have some hopes of what you guys have taken away from these past two sessions. I hope you have more tools and strategies to add to your toolbox to try. Hopefully, a mindset of trial and error. It's so important with these and the strategies and finding out what works for you. We need to test out different strategies to know what is actually effective for you and what's not. So, giving yourself grace in those situations. And reflection, adding more reflecting to your recovery plan to see what went well, what strategies worked, what didn't go well, and the strategies that you can try for next time. And having openness to advocate for yourself when you need help for yourself to thrive in competition in your environment. Mm. Okay. And then in certain aspects, like if you're trying these in your season and you're feeling like the strategies are you're trying to implement them, but it's not going the way you want it to, or you're having a hard time actually structuring it and knowing how to implement it and needing extra support, psychotherapy can be helpful. If there's external factors such as life events that happen during your season, there's relationship issues or trauma, a traumatic event that's affecting your performance, and you need help processing it so it doesn't affect your performance negatively, it's also a really good opportunity for psychotherapy as well. So I am a registered psychotherapist qualifying, and I offer virtual psychotherapy sessions. So nice in that sense for preparing for shows. You don't have to go somewhere in that for that commitment. Also to see if it's something that you're interested in, I offer those free 20-minute consultations either over the phone or online as well. So if you're thinking about it and you're not quite sure, it's free and it's not too much of your time for a commitment to see if you'd want to try something. And yeah, that's my personal contact. If you do want to, you decide you would like to book a consultation or sessions, or you're interested or just have questions about the process in general, just feel free to reach out to me that way too. But yeah, so questions, feel free to ask questions about any of the strategies that we've gone over, or how to implement them, or if you like, feel free to share your experiences if you've had experiences with these situations, or if you've used some of these strategies before, or different ones that you feel like have worked really well for you in your seasons. Also, feel free to share that. But yeah, I'll leave it open to you guys. You can raise your hand and speak out, or we can do if you want to write something in the chat, that's fine as well.
That's awesome. Thanks, Elise. I really like how you're talking about like neutral mindset and everything, because I think that's the hardest part, to stay positive, but not so positive if you're winning.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Looks
I
like
think I
Kim
see
has a
Kim.
question.
Sorry, I'm having a hard time getting myself on. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks so much, Elise. I was just thinking that I think maybe I don't get nervous so much as intense, which is fine for
Mhm.
me. Like I function fine under intensity, but I think my horse feels it. So she only ever runs away cross country with me when I'm at the competition, and I think it's because I get kind of intense. And so I just wondered if you had any thoughts about strategies of like lightening up a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's another thing is like, what if intensity works for you and like pressure works for you and you kind of need to get yourself hyped up and you can feel intense and that works for you for performance, but doesn't work for your horse. Very important thing to consider when we have teammates in the sport. What I would say for that is doing the strategies, like allowing yourself to be intense before you get on. So like even for myself, something I used to use, like I needed to get myself pumped up, but I couldn't do that on my horse. So I would like listen to music and I would allow myself to be intense and allow myself to get there. But then the moment that I got to my horse, I kind of had to just focus on the regulation strategies. It didn't matter that my mindset didn't change at all. I was still able to use the intensity to hype myself up in a sense, but also had to be really aware of the difference between my internal experience versus your external experience. So that's important. Just because you relax your body doesn't mean that your thoughts are less intense or your internal experience is less intense. You can still have that. And I think it's just one of those things to be aware of, to know that two things can exist at once. You can have a more relaxed body and do those mindfulness strategies to relax your body for your horse, but you can also have a different internal experience. You can allow yourself to maintain that kind of intensity internally as well. But it's just trying to separate the two and then structuring how do you warm up and allow yourself to have that intensity for yourself if it's helpful, and then transition it differently for that half hour, however long when you have on your warm up and your actual competition when you're in your event too. Yeah. Do we have any? I can't look. Do we have anything in the chat as well?
No.
No questions in the chat,
Okay.
no.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. Does anyone have anything that they've used any of these strategies before? Like you kind of saw them in the presentation, you're kind of reflecting that you've used them before. You recognize it?
I've definitely used the breathing before.
Yeah.
And then also not checking my score is huge for me. I never check till the end of the day anymore, and I found that really makes the day a lot more enjoyable for me.
Yeah. Yeah, it takes pressure off it. It kind of makes it more fun. Also, it takes it back to the fact that we do this because we're trying to get better, we're trying to improve, and we're trying to enjoy it and have fun. It doesn't always come down to the results, especially if it has those negative responses too. And that's something that I definitely played around with for sure. There were definitely times or certain competitions where I didn't want to know, and competitions where I felt lower stress about it didn't affect me as much. So it's a lot about being attuned with how you're feeling and knowing yourself in those moments too. I think you're trying to talk, Doug, but you're muted.
I'm so sorry. The story of my life. I used to be a basket case, especially before dressage.
Okay.
And then after a couple of years, I decided that I'm not competing against anyone else but myself, and just rode for myself. And that
Yeah.
helped me a whole lot to just chill and do the best I can for me and my horse.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so important. I think that comes down to the reframing too of how you view the competition for yourself. Am I monitoring myself based on or measuring myself based on my personal growth and what I'm doing rather than looking at everyone else's results and everyone else's performance and how they're progressing. And I used to run in track, so there was something like a phrase I would always say of like stay in your own lane or like focus on your own lane when you're running in track. Don't worry about where other people are in their other lanes. Just focus on stay in your lane and focus on your own performance. And I think that applies to obviously not just track, but other aspects of competition too, and kind of focusing on yourself. But yeah. Any other thoughts or questions?
I guess not. That was awesome. I guess you covered everything very well, Elise.
It's also so informational at some point. Hopefully everyone kind of gathered something and then gets to use them, and then maybe questions will come later next year.
It was
But
good. You gave so many options for everyone that hopefully there's something for everyone. And I liked how you said everyone has to just experiment with it to figure out what works for them.
oh yeah.